Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, you know the big story tonight. Peter Mandelson has been arrested. We'll bring you updates as the story of the Prince of Darkness being arrested by the police today unfolds. Also today, lots to talk about as well as that. Labour are ramping up their attacks on the Green Party. Martin Lewis has gone head-to-head with Kemi Badenoch in a row over student loans. OpenAI CEO Sam Altman has laid out a terrifying new vision for humanity. He's not hiding it, or he's getting very bad PR advice anyway. And there are some BBC double standards at the BAFTAs. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined tonight by Helena, a.k.a. NoJusticeMTG. Are you feeling ready to bosh through all of these big stories, Helena?
Always happy to do so with yourself, Michael. Shame I couldn't be in the studio for the last minute entry into the Novara lineup tonight, but very, very happy to be, at the very least, in spirit in the Novara Media Studio.
Yes, thank you for standing in somewhat last minute. Ash is slightly under the weather today, but we should have her back on Wednesday, so you should get your fix of Ash Sarkar later in the week. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments below. First story, former British ambassador to the US, Peter Mandelson, has been arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. Late this afternoon, Mandelson was led away from his London house by Metropolitan Police officers who escorted him to a waiting car. From there, he was driven away, presumably to a police station. A spokesperson for the Metropolitan Police has said this. Officers have arrested a 72-year-old man on suspicion of misconduct in public office. He was arrested at an address in Camden on Monday and has been taken to a London police station for an interview. This follows search warrants at two addresses in Wiltshire and Camden areas. I find it so iconic, the whole, like the 72-year-old man, when you know exactly who it is. It does feel a bit more demeaning, like if they just said we've arrested Peter Mandelson, but he's just, any old 72-year-old man who's been arrested by the police. Mandelson, of course, was sacked as ambassador over his continuing friendship with Jeffrey Epstein following the billionaire's 2008 conviction on child sex charges. He has, of course, denied any wrongdoing, but later revelations from a US Department of Justice upload of Jeffrey Epstein's emails and files appeared to show Mandelson forwarding Epstein confidential and potentially market-sensitive information while he was a minister in the Gordon Brown government. Other emails in the upload showed that Epstein sent Mandelson $75,000 in 2003 and 2004. He also sent thousands of pounds in 2009 and 2010 to Reynaldo Avila da Silva, Mandelson's partner. That's all according to the files. And all of that led to Prime Minister Keir Starmer being forced to admit in the House of Commons that he had known about Mandelson's post-conviction friendship with Epstein's, that's post-Epstein's conviction, when he appointed him US ambassador in late 2024. Now, as a result of that, Downing Street is being forced to hand over hundreds of thousands of documents relating to Mandelson, including ministers' electronic communications, that's emails and WhatsApps, with Starmer said to be fearful of what could be revealed. And we might find out very soon whether he's right to be worried. So the government has said today that it will publish the first tranche of those documents very shortly, and with the Prime Minister's Chief Secretary saying early March. Now, as I said, Mandelson has been arrested under suspicion of misconduct in public office. But what is it? Everyone's trying to get their head around this particular crime over the past couple of weeks. I found this explainer on Channel 4 particularly useful. They made this after Prince Andrew was arrested under suspicion of the same offence as Mandelson.
Misconduct in public office carries a maximum sentence of life in prison under UK law. Essentially, it means someone doing a job on behalf of the British public abuses their power. But it's quite complicated to convict because there's no definition of what makes it punishable. What does exist, and what the police will have to prove in order to charge the former prince, is this 4-step test. First, they have to determine if the person being investigated is or was a public officer, and that the alleged crime was committed while they were acting in that role. If that's established, they move on to step 2, that the person in question willfully neglected their legal duty or intentionally did something wrong. So it wasn't just an honest mistake or incompetence. The third question is, were their actions so serious that they abused the public's trust? And finally, if all of those have been agreed, police then need to decide if a person had a reasonable excuse or justification. No MPs, or royals for that matter, have ever been convicted of this crime. A private citizen tried to prosecute former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson in 2019 over allegations he lied during the Brexit campaign. But the High Court threw it out. So who has been convicted of this crime? Well, last year, Amy Duke, a 26-year-old prison officer, was jailed for 12 months over an inappropriate relationship with an inmate. And in 2024, a former Ministry of Defence official, Geoffrey Cook, was convicted of taking over £70,000 in secret gifts and payments. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison and ordered to pay back £123,000.
So that's the explanation there. They've got to meet those 4 categories. And yeah, it seems to normally be used against people such as prison officers, never has been used for someone as high ranking as an MP or, as that commentator there said, a royal. Helena, I suppose this is now an active case, so we shouldn't really speculate on the guilt or otherwise of Mandelson. That could be in contempt. But the politics of this, I mean, just means that Mandelson's going to keep being in the newspapers. People are going to keep thinking about this scandal. We can't really comment on whether he's guilty or not, but we've all seen those emails which show that he was acting in what to me looks like a deeply immoral way when he was in public office. And it just makes the decision to have appointed him as US ambassador sort of even worse. Every time that man's face appears on the TV screen, I think it's bad for Keir Starmer.
Oh, I totally agree. I think that the real political ramification of this is just a constant news cycle involving Peter Mandelson, who, first of all, as you point out, didn't need to be there. He didn't need to be in the news cycle. It was an active choice of Starmer and McSweeney to elevate this man to the high office of US ambassador, knowing, what they knew at the time was the fact that this guy had previously been removed from public office for let's say, unscrupulous behavior before, and thought that he's our guy for Washington. That's a decision that they made. And what happens with this case or not is by the by. As far as the public interest is concerned, the public's perception of what Peter Mandelson represents in the political class is going to keep coming back. There's going to be the files coming out from the humble address that was passed in Parliament that was asked for by the Conservative Party. All of the kind of the Mandelson files as they're being talked about will end up being viewable with the public. I mean, Wes Streeting was so kind of resigned to the fact that he would be found out. He gave up willingly his WhatsApp messages that he had with Peter Mandelson to the public so that they could be scrutinised in the realm of public opinion. So this trail is going to continue following Keir Starmer for weeks, months, potentially even years ahead if he decides to stay on as Prime Minister. And what people internally in the Labour Party should be thinking is, do we want that albatross around our neck for months and months and months and months and months? Is this something we want to have dominating the news cycle? Surely they think at the very least that their government has done good things whilst in office. They must think that some of the party manifesto policies that they campaigned for at the election are worth being part of the news cycle outside of people like Peter Mandelson, or indeed other parts of the indiscretions of this government in terms of people they've appointed or acts that they've engaged in or policies that they've passed. The people who lose out the most if Keir Starmer stays on are the Labour Party. He, as has been pointed out many times in terms of his popularity in the public eye, is an unpopular Prime Minister. He's an unpopular Prime Minister. And on top of this, he will cause damage to the Labour brand by osmosis the longer that he stays on, and the longer that the public think they have confidence in Keir Starmer as well. And the longer and longer and longer that he becomes indelibly linked to what's happening, regardless of this case with regards to Mandelson, the more that it will negatively polarise people, not just towards Keir Starmer, but the Labour Party and its brand more generally. So if there's anything that points me towards the idea that this means that Keir Starmer will be gotten rid of by his own MPs who want to keep their jobs in 2029, or indeed his members who want to see the Labour Party be successful, I think that becomes more likely by the day.
And it is kind of crazy, right? You've got it's kind of a truism that people have lost faith in the establishment, etc. But you've got two institutions, the royal family and then the elected government / sort of New Labour as a sort of dominant force in British politics over the past 30 years, say, along with, the ever-present Tory party. But to have both of them at the same time, having these sort of really key figures under investigation for quite a serious crime, both disgraced in the public eye. I mean, it does feel like a bit of a watershed moment. It doesn't really get bigger than having like a key figure in the Royals and a key figure in the government and New Labour at the same time, potentially being dragged through the courts.
I mean, one thing I keep hearing, or the press keep trying to tell us, is that the public's dislike of Keir Starmer and New Labour is evidence that we've become ungovernable, that it's impossible to be able to win the public over, and that these distractions of what's happening with Mandelson are something that is totally irrelevant to the broader dissatisfaction with the government in this country. I'm like, it's not difficult to be liked by the population. It's not difficult to be liked by the electorate, regardless of political faction. Like Mark Drakeford was well liked in Wales, Ben Houchen is well liked in the North East, and Andy Burnham, as we've seen, given how scared Keir Starmer was of having him stand in Gorton and Denton, he's well loved in Manchester, so much so that he was the one thing that would have kept people in Labour or Labour voters on side for the party. This isn't a failure in terms of the public in accepting politicians. Politicians just keep making huge screw-ups. They keep deliberately scoring own goals and making unforced errors. And naturally, the population are being put off by this. We've seen plenty of politicians across the Anglosphere be popular. Anthony Albanese is very popular. Zohran Mamdani is popular in New York City. Like the idea that there's this innate incumbency disadvantage that's negatively polarizing everybody, I will call nonsense on that. And I think that there is just a problem with a very specific part of the permanent political media class who've acted without the public's understanding of what proper public conduct looks like, and so have become, at the very least, in my mind, complacent about what that must look like. And I think the Labour Together scandal that we've seen in the last few days that's been uncovered by The Times and previously by Paul Holden is another element of why I think that the Labour Party is so hated at the moment. They brought this upon themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's a bit of both. I think it is harder to govern, like, in an age of 24-hour news and social media where you constantly have to be looking at what the latest crisis is. But if ever there were, if ever there were a situation that made it hard to pull apart the different explanations, it would be Keir Starmer, because he's just done everything wrong. I think it is inherently a difficult time to be a popular leader. Plus, this guy has made the wrong decision every time. I've seen some people in the comments say that this is a good time for the Greens to go into a by-election. So that is a good time for us to move on to the next element of our story, though I'm sure the arrest of Peter Mandelson will play into this one. Thursday's Gorton and Denton by-election in Greater Manchester has quickly become one of the most viciously fought elections in recent years. And it's the Green Party that's taking most of the heat. That's no surprise, because the Greens candidate, Hannah Spencer, may be on the verge of making a breakthrough, upsetting both Reform UK and the Labour Party. So this is a poll which was done by Omnosis, I suppose, has Greens on 33%, Reform on 29%, Labour on 26%. So that was sort of published last week. We showed you that on Friday. Both Labour and Reform have quite vigorously contested that poll with fairly similar arguments. So Matt Goodwin posted this. This poll was commissioned by Opal Limited, which has previously donated £10,000 to the Greens. Don't believe everything you see. He is correct. This poll was commissioned by an organisation which seems to have donated to the Greens. It is a fairly small N, which means, the number of people who were polled is fairly small. But the best quality poll we have from the constituency so far. Meanwhile, Labour Deputy Leader and Manchester MP Lucy Powell said this: "No one should take this poll seriously, funded by a Green donor, incredibly small sample and half unlikely to vote, over-indexes parts of the constituency with a large Muslim minority, and then also graduates and students." Of course, some of those can be Muslims too. It's the Muslim community, though, that this Urdu ad released by the Greens today is aimed at.
को गोर्टन और डेंटन एक जुल्म सियासतदान जीत सकता है अगर हम रिफॉर्म को रोकने के लिए ग्रीन को वोट ना दें।
मेरा नाम हना स्पेंसर है। मैं ग्रीन पार्टी की उम्मीदवार हूँ।
Spencer has received some backlash for having the temerity to speak to her potential voters in their own language. So this was Julie Hartley-Brewer's take. Regardless of which party, no campaigning in any election in Britain should be in any language but English or Welsh. If you can't speak English properly, how the hell are you a British citizen and able to vote anyway? This is not a controversial opinion. It's just common sense. Lots of people making that point on Twitter today. I mean, it's very normal in America. Like, you'll often have a politician who speaks in Spanish, and it's not necessarily because the voter doesn't speak in Spanish, but it's a sign of, I suppose, respect, that you sort of care about their community, that you've made that effort. I'm not too fussed about it. Over the weekend, the Daily Mail tried to attack Spencer over claims of hypocrisy. This came out on Saturday. So you can see here, the Green Party's Brexit-mocking eco-zealot candidate in Gorton and Denton, who drives a petrol car, owns 2 homes, and has a taste for globe-trotting holidays. Damning. The details are a little less scandalous, though. So that taste for globe-trotting holidays, well, it turns out it amounts to 5 foreign trips, 4 of them in Europe since 2014. So that's over a period of 12 years. So a holiday every 2 or 3 years is pretty goddamn normal. The petrol car the Mail referred to appears to be a party campaign car. We don't know if it belongs to Hannah Spencer, but I guess being able to drive places is pretty important for a plumber. Also, having a car. This is if the worst you've got of someone is they went on 5 holidays over 12 years and have a car, I'd suggest you don't have particularly good material. The claim also that Spencer owns 2 homes has been explained by the Greens. They told the Mail this: Ms. Spencer has split from her partner but remains on the paperwork for the houses. Hannah Spencer is a real-life working-class human being. That is why she is proving so popular with voters in Gorton and Denton. The Green Party doesn't believe people should be deprived of transport or holidays. We do believe in making public transport easier to use by bringing the railways back into public ownership and improving bus services. We also want to see a frequent flyer levy introduced for the tiny percentage of people who use planes like personal taxis. Hannah's ex-partner worked hard to save up and put down the deposit on an uninhabitable building that is in the process of being renovated. Hannah's name is currently on the paperwork, and like many people who have gone through a similar process will know, it can be complex and takes time to untangle personal, financial and living arrangements. So it seems to me like they're struggling to land a blow on Hannah Spencer, who seems, pretty above board. If, as I say, if this is the worst they got on the person, she seems like a good candidate. Labour, though, have also been on the tack when it comes to the Green Party's policies. This was posted by Labour over the weekend.
The Green Party claims, in the majority of cases, recreational drug use can enhance human relationships and creativity. But what kind of human relationships are the Greens really talking about enhancing? The Greens would legalise a notorious date rape drug, which they say has euphoric and aphrodisiac properties, and make it available for use in pubs, nightclubs and bars. That would create a terrifying environment for British women trying to stay safe on a night out. Whether it's legalising roofies, pledging to reduce access to life-saving C-sections, or claiming hypnosis can make women's breasts bigger, it's clear Zach Palancy's Greens have a woman problem.
So what was that all about? Well, you know what the hypnosis bit was about. The Green Party, when it comes to drugs, though, they did pass a policy document back in 2019, which has, as a long-term goal, the replacement of prohibition of all drugs, replaced by a legalised, regulated system of drug control. In the short term, it's called for a national commission into, quote, an evidence-based approach to reform of the UK's counterproductive drug laws. Zach Palancy also late last year told the BBC he was in favour of legalising drugs. On GHB, so the drug mentioned in Labour's video, the policy says it would be available for personal use only through specialist pharmacies. Also worth noting that, they've called GHB a date rape drug, and it is used as a date rape drug, which is why I think there would be pretty legitimate concerns in terms of sort of making it easier to access. I'm sure there are arguments that if people can access it anyway, then regulating. It's a complicated story. The reason why it might be given from a pharmacy is because lots of people don't use it for date rape, especially gay people use it for chemsex. And because it does have aphrodisiac and euphoric qualities. I suppose that's why that, it ended up in the Green Party policy proposal like that. Maybe straight people use it as well, I don't know. Gay people definitely do. Not all of them, some of them. People always complain when I sort of suggest that all gay people act the same, but I think that is the group in society who most widely use GHB, I would guess. Labour MP Mike Tapp went on the attack. He said, with the National Crime Agency, I was involved in an operation to arrest an individual who had been importing GHB to spike women. We raided his home and got him in his bed was a woman he had spiked. The Greens would enable that behaviour. Let that sink in. Labour want to stop it. Helena, Labour clearly see this as a weakness that the Greens have. I mean, this is a policy document from 2019, which does say that they want GHB sold from pharmacies. Zach Polanski has said he wants to legalise drugs. Obviously, there are arguments for doing that. At the same time, you know, it would come with risks. Do you think this is a legitimate line of attack from the Labour Party?
Well, in the wise words of the member for Coventry South, they are rattled. Right, you're seeing the preponderance of attacks against the Green Party ramp up from both the right and also the further right, in the case of Reform UK, because they realise that the Green Party are favourites to win the election, and they're desperate to try and ensure that the Green Party don't win by finding even the most nebulous ways of attacking the Green Party by saying, oh, well, you've been on some foreign holidays, this means you're somehow a hypocrite. When again, the reality is the Green Party do not want to take away people's access to be able to go on a holiday each year or whatever it is. Just regular families going on holiday are not the issue when it comes to climate change. The idea that individual actions are of the biggest concern when it comes to a broader systemic change to how we live to try and combat climate change, which is the issue here, rather than incredibly frequent flyers or the petrochemical industry is for the birds. But people have been obsessed with personal carbon footprint ever since British Petroleum did a whole advertising campaign to popularise this idea to take the heat off the petrochemical industry and the aviation industry more broadly. So I don't think any of those wash. I don't think anyone's paying attention to the ex-Tories, the Daily Mail, who are trying to smear Hannah with accusations of hypocrisy. The drug policy stuff is different. Now, broadly, I think that the war on drugs has failed. I think this is the strongest argument the Greens have in response. Broadly, the war on drugs has failed. A lot of people who've been attacking the Greens over their drug policy have previous form in agreeing with this. The war on drugs has failed, like Paul Mason, for example, who said that the Green Party were dangerous, and yet have also you can look back at his old tweets talking about the failure of drug criminalisation and what that has lent to in terms of working class kids being dragged off the street for possession and things like that. So it's weird how a bunch of people's positions on this have changed. Now they think that there's a public weakness for the Green Party. When it comes to things such as passing policy about things like GHB, there is an issue in terms of the public-facing opinion of the Green Party when policy is passed by members. It's done through the plenaries at Green Party conference. That's how it sets policy, rather than top-down from the leadership. So it's weird how some people talk about Zach Polanski's policies. I'm like, no, he is the spokesperson for the Green Party's policies. He may have the biggest prominence as the elected leader, but just like how a trade union general secretary is there to vocalise the concerns of the membership who they're accountable to, the same thing is true with the Green Party leader. They are given the platform to do so by the membership, not the other way around.
Do you think that's...
And when it comes to policies that...
I get that argument, but I do think, you know, he wants to be Prime Minister, and if he's Prime Minister, it doesn't matter what he thinks and what he says, because clearly things are going to come up on a day-to-day basis, and the idea that, you know, we should only care what's passed at a Green Party conference. If he were leader, his opinions would matter, so it seems reasonable, you know, for him to be held account for his opinions.
I mean, that's true, but he's well within his rights to say his own opinions, whilst also prefacing it with what the official Green Party policy is based upon those he's there to represent. I think when he is Prime Minister and in an elected position to be able to do things on the fly, I think that's more relevant. But when it comes to criticising the Green Party's policy prescriptions, I think it's got to be made sure that everyone knows these are coming from the members rather than from Zach himself. But as I was going to say, that this comes with a caveat, which is that maybe the Green Party membership aren't possibly looking at what is going to appeal to the broader electorate. Maybe they're not thinking about how some policy motions are going to look in terms of how they can be weaponized by the media or how they will be interpreted by the general public. And that will come with consequences when it comes to the kind of media attack lines that we're seeing now. And having previously been a political party without much salience, being catapulted into national relevance, being second place in some polls, there might have to be a change in the culture of how the Green Party approach how members set policy, how they decide to write policy, and whether or not that they want to scrutinise policy more broadly in terms of how it will be looked at by the broader electorate. That will probably be a discussion members of the Greens will have moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are seeing that in quite a lot of topics, right, which is fair enough, which is that the Greens have gone from a marginal party to like a mainstream party in a really short space of time. And I think probably like Labour's most successful attacks are to say, you know, they haven't thought through some of their ideas properly. And so Zach Polanski really needs to very quickly, not just based on what's popular, but based on sort of like really think it through, right? Because some of these, I feel like you need to have a long, hard think so that you can properly justify these ideas. I think it's a bit vibes at the moment, which is definitely not a reason not to vote for Hannah Spencer, by the way. I think like the Greens have had a brilliant impact on our political debate. If Hannah wins, that would just continue. But by the time of the next general election, they're going to have to sort some of this stuff out. A special guest made a surprise visit to Gorton and Denton today. That was Keir Starmer there. Some people saying that means he's desperate. Other people saying it means that he thinks that Labour maybe are doing better than we think because he's happy to be associated with it. Someone in the comments just saying it seems to work in Portugal. So in Portugal, they decriminalised drugs. They haven't legalised it. So it's not legal to sell any drugs. Well, I mean, it's legal to sell coffee and tea and alcohol. But I think sometimes people get confused about what policy has been implemented where. Legalization of all drugs, as far as I understand, hasn't really been introduced anywhere, which doesn't mean it's a bad idea. But if you're sort of saying it worked in Portugal, Portugal had a very different policy to what is currently the Green Party policy on this. Helena, further thoughts on drugs if you have them, or thoughts on Keir Starmer having attended Gorton and Denton? How should we read that?
I mean, I'm surprised the members for Gorton and Denton allowed him to go there. I don't know how they think that this would somehow be of a boon to them. He's the most hated prime minister in since records began. I can only think that him turning up, to me, it looks like a sign of desperation. You know, it's a by-election in a constituency where the Labour Party got a supermajority almost. Like their next challengers were 30 or 40 points behind the general election in 2024. They shouldn't have to be campaigning here. They should be winning these things in a traditional era of politics without even having to try, without even having to bother thinking about it. And we're seeing swarms of MPs come down to the constituency to canvass for the Labour Party. And now we're seeing the Prime Minister. You'd think in terms of geopolitical tension, he would have more important things to do. But this is how important and existential it is for the Labour Party. If they start losing seats where they've got a 40-point majority or whatever it is in this constituency, then they know full well this is existential. That was their brief to the press. If Reform wins, it's sad. If the Greens wins, it's existential for the party because they realise that all they've got left is, ironically, what Mandelson was saying about working class people having nowhere else to go. And that proves that that's incorrect. And once people realise that alternative parties have legitimacy and you don't have to vote Labour forever without risking somebody else winning the electorate, the last argument that the Labour Party have to the people who they've deliberately disabused from voting for them, you know, the door is open and you can leave. Well, turns out the door is open, they have left, you've shaken off the fleas and they're voting for different parties and you're losing not just heartland red wall seats that seem to be drifting away before, but seats that have been Labour for generations being lost. They know how dangerous it is for their political brand if they lose this. And as I said, I don't think they're going to gain anything from Starmer turning up, but it looks like desperation to me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose he's too tired of being called a backseat driver and now wants to sort of show some leadership. So he's willing to sort of associate himself with an election, even if Labour lose it, so he can sort of show that he's, you know, not just completely irrelevant. I suppose the idea that he's so unpopular that him turning up would be unhelpful to him is also, you know, maybe damaging to his ego. A tweet from Carla Denya, she said, of Mandelson's arrest, about time, absolutely right that Mandelson is arrested for questioning. We owe so much to the bravery of the women who fought to get the Epstein files released. We must have full accountability from Mandelson and Mountbatten Windsor. I still think we should call Mountbatten Windsor Prince Andrew because I think it's a bit cheeky the way we've sort of just The royal family said, oh, he's not a prince anymore. And now suddenly everyone gets to pretend he's got nothing to do with the royals. Like, once a prince, always a prince, I say. What's the worst nightmare for an aspiring prime minister? Perhaps it's getting caught on camera struggling to eat a bacon sandwich that's caused some damage in the past. Or is it disparaging a member of the public on a hot mic, which is said to have cost Gordon Brown an election in 2010? Or perhaps it's getting called out live on air by Britain's most trusted financial guru on daytime TV. That could be up there. And it was a fate that befell Kemi Badenoch this morning. She was explaining why the Tories were announcing plans to cap the interest rate paid on Plan 2 student loans when Martin Lewis, in very dramatic fashion, came in from off-screen to stick his oar in.
The cut in the interest rate, which you're proposing, will only benefit the richest students, won't it?
I don't think that's right. I think that we need to look at fairness.
Correct.
Well,
I think it's just right.
The fact is,
it's definitely right.
The
vast majority of students will not repay their debt, and therefore the cut in interest rates will make no difference. The only people who will benefit, according to Martin Lewis, are the people who pay off their whole debt, which is the richest 20-25% of students. Why would your priority be only the richest students?
The richest students pay off all their debt. The ones who earn minimum wage never pay it.
But
it's the ones in the middle that we're trying to help.
So they won't benefit from the interest rate cut?
They are not paying off this debt. They are carrying a debt for so many years.
How would they benefit from the cut in the interest rate?
This is about fairness.
How would they benefit from the cut in interest rate?
The lowest earning students, I think, are a separate problem because they've paid all this money for university.
The middle students.
Sorry, Ed, let me finish.
The medians. No, I'm going to ask you a question.
But I have to finish the answer to the last question.
I think it's important you answer the question.
I finished the answer to the last question.
Would the middle student benefit from the cut in the interest rate? Yes or no?
The median earning students are the ones that we are trying to help.
Would they benefit from the cut in interest rate?
Everybody will benefit.
No, they won't.
Yes, they will.
They won't.
I'm sorry.
Okay, noise is off. Is Martin Lewis has come into the studio. Here we go.
Middle earning students. If you want to help the middle earning students, the most important thing is the repayment threshold should have been increased. When the Tories brought this in, it was a graduate contribution system.
It's great television. You've got a kind of dry topic. Obviously, it's a topic we care a lot about, but a kind of dry topic talking about interest rates on student loans. And then you got, it's Martin Lewis coming with the chair. It's like WWE wrestling. He's coming up, he's standing there, he's intervening. Kemi Badenoch terrified. What's going on? To be fair, actually, she dealt with it reasonably. We'll go back to it in a moment. First of all, fill you in. Let's fill you in on some of the context. As we discussed before, there is currently a controversy about Plan 2 student loans, which you may have if you went to university between 2012 and 2023. These loans have an interest rate which starts at RPI inflation, which is already the higher measure of inflation, and then increases for people on higher income. So if you earn over a certain threshold, it goes up to, RPI plus 2 or 3, I think up to 3. The Tories, in response to all the anger about this, have pledged to just charge everyone the RPI rate of inflation, regardless of their income. Now, this, has been welcomed by many because it sort of relieves us of some of the perceived unfairness of the loan. If you've got an interest rate that changes, that's going to be fairly annoying. It will, though, obviously only help those graduates who are on higher incomes, right? Because the lower income graduates are already only paying RPI, and also they're unlikely to pay off their full loans anyway. So that's the context. Let's look at the rest of that, Barney.
Exactly why young people are suffering. We've got lots of people who finished university when they didn't have to pay fees, didn't have to take out loans. And now you're all saying, oh, nothing can be done, don't do this.
I'm not saying nothing can be done, I'm saying what you should do.
Well, I'm the first person who's even trying to solve this problem.
Shall we have a chat about it? Because I think you've got the right idea, but this is not a solution that will help the middle and lower income
Martin, if you want us to have a debate, I'm very happy for us to have a debate.
Does the middle student benefit from a cut in the interest rate?
I think people need to even know what it is I'm talking about. You're both talking over me, excuse me.
Sorry,
let me explain what my policy is. I want to make sure that those young people who are paying and their debt is not going down get a relief. If you think that there's a better offer, let's look at it. But what's made the difference now is that in her budget, Rachel Reeves raised the threshold, so it's dragging more people into it.
Freezing the threshold.
Increase the number of people getting in because the threshold has been frozen. I don't think this is fair.
Agreed.
The whole student loan system is not working properly. Someone has to do something. Definitely. And the thing that shocks me is that the minute I say, well, let's do something, everyone says, oh, no, this is not the right thing. We're going round
cutting
in
the interest
circles.
rate doesn't help them. That's the trouble.
So
we should not be making money off graduate student loans. That is not right.
I 100% agree with you in principle, and I've objected to it since when the Conservative government brought it in 2012. I said we shouldn't have above-inflation interest rates on Plan 2 student loans.
Agree. That was 5 years before I became an MP. A new generation of Conservatives
where we are now,
we are changing
as the interest has already been added to so many students' loans, lowering the interest rate now will only help those who can clear within the 30 years, which means lower and middle-earning graduates won't benefit from that change.
Just to break that down, Martin Lewis is saying that lowering interest rates will only make a difference to those people who will ever clear their debts. So your debts get wiped after 30 years. Not many students actually will pay it off before that 30 years. So it doesn't really matter if at the 30-year moment you've got 10,000 or 30,000 because it's all, it disappears at that point. Only a minority of students ever pay it off before that 30-year limit is reached, which means that for the majority of students, or not students because we're talking about graduates here, what matters most isn't the total amount of your debt, which goes up with interest, but rather the threshold at which you start paying back that debt, which in other words, sort of the marginal tax you pay above the threshold, or the threshold at which you start paying that extra marginal tax, which is the 6 or 9% that goes towards your student loan. So Martin Lewis saying what the Tories should have proposed is to raise the threshold at which the student loan begins to be paid back instead of sort of fixing the interest rate at a lower level. Helena, who's right?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the Conservative position on this is coming from an ideological position of we treat education like a commodity. They've paid for the commodity, so we shouldn't change the number of people who pay as much towards the commodity as possible before it gets written off. But what we should do is ensure that no one pays more than what they originally did in terms of real value, because otherwise that undermines the contract between the state and the people. And whilst I understand that position, I totally disagree because I don't think education is a commodity. Whereas with Martin Lewis, it's a very kind of perfunctory argument of, well, I don't really care whether we charge people for education or whether we pay for it through general taxation. What I actually have an immediate concern with is who can afford to live? How are we going to deal with people's disposable income now during a cost of living crisis? And I have far more of a sympathetic viewpoint with what Martin Lewis is saying here. First of all, as has been pointed out already, because it broadly benefits poorer students who are less likely to pay off their student loan and just going to sit there with a huge additional marginal tax rate that is making it increasingly unaffordable. Some richer old people will not pay as high a marginal tax rate, even though they went to university and got the university paid for free at the point of use through general taxation. That's even more intergenerational unfairness on top of the fact that you're being charged for education in the first place. Now, there are lots of different arguments in terms of why I think education should be a public good and why claims such as, well, we can't just give people degrees free at the point of use paid for by taxation because they might get Mickey Mouse quote unquote degrees, when no one really knows what the future economy is going to look like or which skills are going to be in demand. By putting all of the onus on students at the age of 17 in lots of cases to decide what their future career trajectory should be based upon the economic status of the country right now is nonsense, when in 30 years' time, when these people will still be in the workforce, it could look completely different. By encouraging high economic uptake of educational resources, whether it be apprenticeships or degrees, that creates a reserve of people with educations to be able to draw upon redundant capacity should the economy look different. Like, we don't know if in 25 years' time it might lead loads of media studies graduates that everyone is poo-pooing as being totally irrelevant right now who are getting Mickey Mouse degrees. They may not be likely, but it certainly could possibly be the case, which is why I think education broadly is a public good. And it's because of that belief, I think that neither of these people are correct. I think that the reality here is that if we really wanted actual justice for students, both in terms of the rich versus poor students versus the ones who've managed to get the good degrees or the ones who've managed to get degrees which aren't as relevant, for example, or indeed the intergenerational unfairness of young people and younger people having been charged for an education that their parents' generation got free at the point of use, is to increase taxes on the wealthiest, the multimillionaires and the billionaires, to increase capital gains tax, and to engage in taxes on mega corporations, for example, to not only fund education again free at the point of use, but to cancel student debt. Now, Pippa Crerar on Peston the other week when this topic of discussion came up, pointed to the idea that there was hundreds of billions of pounds worth of outstanding student loan debt. But I'm like, most people won't pay that off. And when it gets paid off, it'll get paid off over the course of 40 years. And when you look at it on a yearly increase in taxation, it really isn't that much. And when you think of this instead of the cost of the commodity of a degree and treat them like public utilities rather than as individual commodities, and you think of the holistic value of an educated population, in my mind, the extra 7, 8, 9 billion per year that it would cost, or 10 billion, something like that, that's absolutely a price worth paying.
The argument I keep seeing on like Twitter from centrists and people on the right is to say, look, it's fair enough to have this conversation, but there's two options. Either we can go back to having way fewer people going to university and make it free or super cheap and basically have the state pay for it, or we can have half the population going to university and the students will have to pay for it because there's no way a government can afford for that many people to go to university, which on the face of it, I've said this before on the show, it doesn't sound crazy, but there is an example of a very similar country to our own where a similar number of people go to university and it costs only 170 euros a year to go to university, which is France. So here it costs 9 grand, there it costs 170 euros, right? So the argument that you have to choose one or the other, the Tories, by the way, they're saying they'll cap this interest rate by sending less people to university. It doesn't seem to me that that is a choice we necessarily have to make. Of course, France has much higher taxes. Me and Helena both agree taxes should really be higher in this country. The energy use of data centers has become a political hot potato for the AI industry. Data centers famously gobble up both electricity and water, and some areas near new data centers have seen a hike in bills. But OpenAI's Sam Altman has said criticism of AI's energy use aren't fair.
One of the things that is always unfair in this comparison is people talk about how much energy it takes to train an AI model relative to how much it costs a human to do one inference query. But it also takes a lot of energy to train a human. It takes like 20 years of life and all of the food you eat during that time before you get smart. And not only that, it took like the very widespread evolution of the 100 billion people that have ever lived and learned not to get eaten by predators and learned how to like figure out science and whatever to produce you, and then you took whatever you took. So the fair comparison is if you ask ChatGPT a question, how much energy does it take once its model is trained to answer that question versus a human? And probably AI has already caught up on an energy efficiency basis measured that way.
Well, that's reassuring. Don't worry about AI's energy use, because if we really care about energy use, we could kill the people. I suppose we'll have less of us. I mean, I think the argument he's trying to make, well, I don't know what argument. If you were being incredibly generous, you would say he was responding to a kind of point, which is saying, AI is not that impressive because if you have this much energy, then you can make something intelligent. We did it ourselves. Now, AI is very impressive. Like, regardless of the amount of energy it uses, it is an impressive technology. I say this all the time. But the criticism of AI's energy use is that we might want to use that energy for something else. And he's saying, well, if you want to save energy, it's the people who are remarkably inefficient. Helena, do you like the implications of that argument?
I mean, it's real kind of part and parcel of how much brain worms you have to have imbibed before you kind of are allowed into the kind of tech bro sphere in terms of how you perceive the concept of humanity, insofar as I think a lot of us, especially on the political left maybe, we view things that are done both in terms of the economy and politically to serve the interests of people. We have this humanistic understanding of how human society functions, and then we want to build an economy on top of that that serves the interest of people. Whereas if you become so captured by cultural neoliberalism, where you commodify everything to the point at which you think of, well, how can something be treated as solely as an economic unit, including people themselves, and go, well, this economic unit uses as much energy as this economic unit that isn't human, and therefore you can make a comparison as such. The only way in my mind I think you can ever get to that position in the first place is if you just don't perceive human life as having value outside of an economic interaction and go, well, energy costs money, we have to produce energy, but why would we spend energy on people when we can produce something that is better in terms of this economic output? I'm like, well, machines are just economic output, but humans are rational actors who have all sorts of hopes and dreams that they want to use economic access to be able to fulfill. And that's my position when it comes to how we build an economy. I think it's broadly how most people in the chat probably agree as well about how to build an economy, is for the concept of increasing human flourishing. But it appears in the tech bro realm, the creation of a better future only involves human flourishing by happenstance. It only will happen to involve those things if that is how the market mechanisms direct that it should. And if that isn't a kind of base assumption of right-wing economics and neoliberalism and a kind of almost religious belief in market logic as the defining characteristic of human society, and then I don't know what else is.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on how we should think about the economy. I think there's something else going on. I mean, I think that's also partly behind what Sam Altman is saying. I listen to quite a lot of kind of tech podcasts and read their blogs and stuff. And I think there's another ideology in here, which is kind of post-humanism. And what you'll often hear with some of the Silicon Valley tech bros is instead of sort of like people and machines, they talk about intelligences. So they say sort of like humans are intelligences and then machines are intelligences. And instead of seeing this as about sort of profit and efficiency, you can see their aim is to maximize the number of intelligences in the universe. And we should organize our resources so as to do that maximization. And so it's not necessarily, they're not always, I mean, clearly Sam Altman is fussed about the profit of his company and wants to get very rich. But when it comes to sort of the ideology they're articulating, it's often that sort of there's nothing inherently special about humans. What we're interested in is understanding the universe. I think that's Elon Musk's sort of slogan for XAI, but lots of them talk in that way. And therefore, if it's a fleshy intelligence doing the thinking, or a silicon intelligence doing the thinking, it would be parochial to have a preference between those two. And if the silicon intelligence is more effective given the resources we have, we should direct our resources towards the silicon intelligence. So it's sort of, I see where you're coming from with the neoliberalism argument, but I think their argument is almost more novel than that. I don't know what you think.
I mean, I can understand that. I mean, you probably have interacted with more kind of primary material coming out of the AI sector than I have. So if that is the case of the way in which that you characterize these people's arguments, if these people didn't have the huge amounts of power that they did, it'd be quite funny, really. It'd be quite cringe in that these people think that they're living in the science fiction world of the films that they watched as a child, right? And you know what? Whilst I think that the ideology itself would be dangerous, I would look at these people with pity rather than with the level of kind of the skepticism that I have right now, because these people have huge amounts of power. These people are going to be potentially shaping the future of society and the future of the economy through the amount of economic power that they have attained. And them being able to continually self-rationalize what I feel very an anti-human ideology, again, that equates the human intelligence with that of just like any other machine. And given how much influence they have in some world governments, especially the most powerful government in the world, kind of terrifies me. I'm not sure about anybody else at home.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can have a philosophical argument about why you think. I mean, I like fleshy intelligences because I suppose I am parochial in the sense that I like people and humans, and I think that if you could create something similar in a machine, I think probably don't do it because it just comes with so many moral quandaries. I don't. If they do develop hopes and dreams, and then we're sort of enslaving them all to help us, that's a bit grim. If we're giving them hopes and dreams and then they have agency and can kill us all, that's a bit scary. That's why I feel a bit like let's not go there. But what I find is remarkable with statements like that from Sam Altman and some of the podcasts I've been listening to where they talk about post-humanism and sort of why we shouldn't be parochial and have more attachment to the fleshy intelligences than the silicon intelligences, is how anti-democratic it is. Because clearly, whether or not you think we should be sort of post-humanists or transhumanists and not have a particular attachment to humans, the humans are not going to consent to that. We're not okay with that. I don't want to be replaced, right, by the silicon intelligences. So clearly there are enough people, though, in Silicon Valley who think that sort of like it doesn't matter what other people think because the future is going to be determined by a few thousand people working in a few very well-funded companies in Silicon Valley, and everyone else, screw them. That's sort of how I read the culture coming out of Silicon Valley at the moment and how I read what Sam Altman said there. If he doesn't realize how, terrifying what he said sounded, that's probably because of the kind of circles he's moving in, where saying that kind of thing sounds normal, right? Because I suppose they think that they're not going to be the ones who are sacrificed on the altar of silicon-based intelligence, I assume. There's been a big debate today over an unfortunate event at last night's BAFTA Awards.
Delroy and I are delighted to be presenting the first BAFTA of the night for a vital part of movie making. We're here to celebrate.
So that was the actors Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo being heckled at last night's BAFTA Awards. I say heckled, having a word shouted at them. Now, the word we bleeped out was the N-word, being shouted from the audience. Now, of course, shouting the N-word to black actors on the stage would have been a blatant, shocking, disgusting act of outright racism. However, there was a complication here. That's because the man who yelled the remark was John Davidson, a Tourette's campaigner who suffers from involuntary verbal tics. Now, Davidson was at the awards ceremony because he's the subject of a new biopic called I Swear, which won quite a few awards at the ceremony. Now, that particular moment divided many on the internet. So the actor, Jamie Foxx, posted this. Out of all the words you could have said, Tourette's makes you say that. And then he says, nah, he meant that shit, unacceptable. Now, there were quite a lot of comments of this sort saying, yeah, Tourette's, sure, he's got to shout something, but why did he shout that? Clearly, that's sort of showing us what's really in his soul. Now, that is a complete misunderstanding of how Tourette's works. As far as I understand, you are specifically saying the thing that you, in a way, don't want to say. So it's sort of the involuntary blurting out of what would often be the most inappropriate thing to say in that context. So the fact he's saying that, it's not a surprise. Right, that you definitely cannot say he meant that shit when someone suffers from Tourette's. Like that's just a misunderstanding of what's going on here. Someone with a more thoughtful take, though, was Hannah Beachler. She's an Oscar-winning American production designer who worked on the film Sinners, which was also up for many awards. She said this, I keep trying to write about what happened at the BAFTAs and I can't find the words. The situation is almost impossible. But it happened 3 times that night, the N-word being shouted. And one of the 3 times was directed at myself on the way to dinner after the show, and a 3rd time at a black woman. I understand and deeply know why this is an impossible situation. I know we must handle this with grace and continue to push through. But what made the situation worse was the throwaway apology of if you were offended. So that was the host, Alan Cummings, I think, sort of said, sorry if you were offended, but someone has Tourette's, so that's why this has happened. And Hannah Beachler thinks that was sort of dismissive of how hurtful it might have been to be on stage and have that word shouted at you, even if the person who shouted it is in no way to blame. Very complicated. If there was a straightforward failure, though, one was from the BAFTAs, and that was by not speaking properly to the actors who'd faced the slurs. So Delroy Lindo, one of the men on stage, he said that he wished someone from BAFTA had spoken to them both afterwards, which clearly implies no one had spoken to them to sort of say, well, this is why this happened. I hope you're okay. The BBC also came under fire for not editing out the slur. And this was especially sort of the case given that there was a 2-hour delay between the event and it being broadcast on the BBC. So there was plenty of chance to. And their failure to edit it out was especially apparent given what they did decide was too offensive for viewers to hear. Namely this speech by British-Nigerian filmmaker Akinola Davis Jr.
And lastly,
To all those whose parents migrated to obtain a better life for their children, to the economic migrant, the conflict migrant, those under occupation, dictatorship, persecution, and those experiencing genocide, you matter, your stories matter more than ever. Your dreams are an act of resistance. To those watching at home, archive your loved ones, archive your stories, yesterday, today, and forever. For Nigeria, for London, the Congo, Sudan, free Palestine. Thank you.
So clearly, I suppose after the Bob Dylan controversy last year, like everyone at the BBC was like really primed. If anyone says free Palestine, edit it out, get rid of that. But no one had thought, what if someone says the M word? Maybe we should also get rid of that. So well, I say the double standards here are outrageous. The BBC, I mean, I think editing out free Palestine is outrageous in and of itself. In terms of the comparison after the row blew up, the BBC have claimed that their failure to beep the N-word or edit it out was because the show was being edited from a truck. So it's one of those media trucks. They sometimes do interviews from them on the Today program or whatever. And they said that because they were in a truck, they didn't hear the slur. So maybe the failure here was communication between different parts of the BBC, because clearly there were many people in the room for whom that event was the most notable of the evening. Helena, how do you think this, I suppose this situation, let's call it that, not a row or a controversy, how should this situation be navigated?
Well, I think that, first of all, have you producers who are paying attention to bleep these things out. Maybe I should probably just put that first, I'm not buying the excuse that they just didn't hear it. It's quite prominent in the audio. I think that something like that causing such a stir politically and globally, I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect these things to be found during the editing process, especially with a 2-hour delay. It's not like Alex who has to get out Novara live, half an hour after we finish broadcasting. With a 2-hour delay and a huge team of professional media crews to do this, I think that we can do a little better than just, whoops, missed the N-word. Probably reasonable to expect higher levels of competency in terms of the national broadcaster. But when it comes to the Tourette stuff, I think that's an unfortunate reality. I think it's a very misunderstood situation that people find themselves in. They do have Tourette's. And again, because it will happen a lot of the time where the most socially kind of abrasive thing will come out, because that's the whole it's the taboo that gets broken, and that's why it becomes the tick people have. And that is unfortunate, but that's just the reality. And we have grown to deal with this, and I don't know why it's difficult for other people to understand this kind of reality. And campaigners have been doing really good work in trying to educate people on the reality of what it's like being as someone who suffers with Tourette syndrome. In regards to the fact that they edited out an entire segment talking about occupation, talking about what's happening globally, and talking about Palestine, shows you that, the BBC is concerned about how it is perceived in the media around, I think, given the kind of people who are pretty brazen in their attacks on the BBC. We've seen the cancel the license fee to fund the BBC campaign going absolutely haywire around the kind of right-wing media circus, and it's picking up some actual traction now that Reform UK are being a really kind of strong moment in the political scene. They're far more wary about what will incense the UK media, such as platforming anybody with pro-Palestinian voices, than they are about something like a racial slur, which I don't know about anybody else. I don't see Talk TV caring much about that. Do you?
What the N-word? I mean, I think whoever sort of puts that out is going to have some backlash. The thing I find funny about the BBC is sort of like how reactive it always seems. So it doesn't seem like they've sort of come up with some internal sort of standards based on like ethics and properly thought through morality. It's like the Bob Dylan. I mean, that wasn't Free Palestine. That was Kill the IDF, wasn't it? Or something like that. But then there was this backlash, and then it sort of seems like, there was this internal memo. Guys, really, no one should say Kill the IDF, and then say, actually, also Free Palestine. Let's get rid of Free Palestine as well. So there's just this constant list of things you can't say. And now someone in the BBC has had to add the M-word. Also the M-word, don't say the N-word. And now that's suddenly banned. Well, it should be banned, of course, on the BBC, but it just seems like they're always a couple of steps behind.
Quite so. Yeah, it does seem to be the case that I guess reputation management is really on their minds right now because they come under attacks from all sides. Legitimately in some cases, and incredibly illegitimately when it comes to what claims. I think I saw Tim Montgomery saying this, that somehow the BBC was being anti-Israel. I'm just like, excuse me, where? Citation needed. But it's clear when the BBC is facing a legitimacy crisis in the face of very difficult reporting on what's happening in Palestine, and of course what's happening in terms of potential litigation from the Trump administration. Anything and everything that may implicate people's public perception of the BBC is getting scrutinized more greatly as time goes on, and this is the consequence.
Yeah, it's worth noting, as people are tempted to sort of think in an unsympathetic way. The question of how the BBC handled this or how the BAFTAs handled this, I think very much open for debate. In terms of the Tourette's campaigner, apparently when he met the Queen, he said "F the Queen" and called her a bitch. So this is someone who doesn't discriminate when it comes to saying things you're not supposed to say. Yeah, exactly. Helena, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure as always.
An absolute pleasure, likewise.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.